The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, do you know what that symbol of authority in 1 Corinthians 11 is?
I think I've got it figured out.
Okay, well, good. But we'll talk about this evening. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. It's wonderful to have Trevor working with me in this program. Trevor, please introduce yourself and tell about the congregation in Payette.
Sure, thanks, Keith. Yeah, my name is Trevor Campbell, and I worship over in Payette. I preach at the Church of Christ there in Payette, located on Highway 62, next to the tractor dealership in Payette. We're on the north side of the highway, and you'll see on the screen there our meeting times. We meet on Sunday mornings. You can join us for a worship service at 10:45 a.m. on Sunday mornings, and you'll see a phone number on the screen there as well. That's my number. If you have a question about the church that meets there, or about what we practice or preach or anything, you can call me at that number. Also, if you have a question for this program, you can call me at that number as well. It's 870-435-2737. And again, if you're in Marion County or that area, come out and join us for worship service. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, Trevor. And of course, I'm Keith Sharp, preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ here in Mountain Home. We meet 1 mile south of the Highway 62-412 bypass on Highway 5, going down towards Salesville. As you're going south, we're on the left. During the coronavirus pandemic, we have only one service on Sunday. That's at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. You are invited to that service. We practice all the things that the governor recommends in order to try to keep from letting anybody get the coronavirus. So at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and then we have a Wednesday evening study at 7 o'clock. You're invited to both of those. We have a 10 o'clock Wednesday morning Bible class for the ladies Bible class. And you ladies are invited to come to that at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. So 11 o'clock Sunday morning, 7 o'clock Wednesday night for our regular services. And the ladies class, 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Now, if you have a question for me, that's what we want you to do, is to give us the questions you have. You can give them to Trevor, you can give them to me, whichever you're comfortable with, and get in touch with us in whatever way you're comfortable in getting in touch. But you can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@sunlink.net. Or you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. And we hope you'll be in touch and let us know what your question is. Well, we have a question to deal with this evening, and the question is, what is the symbol of authority in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 10? Trevor, I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 10. I'm just going to read the verse first of all. It says, "For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." All right, now in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it is a difficult chapter for sure. And so it's a good question because there's a lot of debate over this chapter and a lot of misunderstanding regarding it. But you'll notice in verse 10 it says, "For this reason." So we need to back up in the text to understand this better. Now I'm going to back up all the way to the beginning of the chapter though, and kind of start from there. You know, the chapter does deal with head coverings. And it also deals with symbols of authority in this case, as was mentioned. And it deals with submission or a order of subjection, if you will. Beginning in chapter 11 in verse 1, Paul says, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." And I'm just going to stop right there and talk a little bit about this first portion, specifically in verse 3 there, what Paul is talking about. All right, notice that he says that the head of woman is man. You know, he's going to talk about head coverings. He's going to talk about long hair. He's going to talk about having your head shaved and so forth, back and forth in these next verses. But we need to understand some things ahead of time, I believe. He says the head of woman is man. Well, there's two situations that the Bible talks about in which women are to be in subjection to man. One is in the assembly, in church, in the assembly, and the other is in the home, in the husband and wife relationship. And that I'm aware of, Keith, that's the only two places where subjection is to be shown, excuse me, as far as a woman to a man. So he says the head of woman is man. Now, in this text, he's not going to be talking about in the assembly specifically, because he's going to be talking about women praying and prophesying. I'll just briefly read verse 5. He says, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head." And I'll just stop right there for now. So he's talking in the context about women praying and prophesying. Well, in the assembly, women were not to speak. In fact, in this very same letter that Paul writes to Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 14, in verse 34, he says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. But they are to be submissive, as the law also says." All right, so right there in the same letter that he writes to this church in Corinth, they are not to have their women speaking in church. Well, here in chapter 11, he's talking about women praying and prophesying. So clearly, this isn't being done in the assembly. This is outside of the assembly. So as I mentioned earlier, there's only two times that women are to be in submission. One is in the church or the assembly. The other is in the home. Well, you might have noticed there in 1 Corinthians 14 that I just read that Paul says, "as the law also says," when he talks about women being in subjection. Well, the law that he's referring to, I believe, is all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And this is where he talks about the husband and wife relationship. Genesis chapter 3, and in verse 16, this is after Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. God said to the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desires shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." All right, so there was order in the household there in which the woman was to be in subjection to her husband, and that has never changed. And Paul relates that idea there in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. But in our context that we're dealing with of chapter 11, regarding this order of subjection, if you will, he says the head of woman is man. In the context, we're not dealing with being in church or being in the assembly, because women aren't speaking in the assembly, as he's going to talk about women praying and prophesying in the text. We're not in the assembly, so what are we dealing with? We're dealing with men and women who are married. In this case, it's specifically dealing with women who are married, and they're going to be praying or prophesying. So I just kind of wanted to say those things to kind of kick things off there. Keith, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I want to just explain a couple of things. This is not at all in disagreement with Trevor, as we're leading up to the question in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 10 about the symbol of authority. And one is that the kind of speaking that women are forbidden to do in the worship assembly is the kind of speaking that Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. So let's just look at that passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. "Let your women keep silent in the churches." And I believe the word churches there is used of the worship assembly. That's what the context, the entire 14th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians is talking about, the public worship assembly particularly, and specifically the use of miraculous spiritual gifts in the public worship assembly. So that's the context when you're talking about the churches. It's the worship assemblies. And it says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak." Well, does that mean they can't say anything at all? If it does, then they're not allowed to sing with the congregation, even though they're commanded to sing. We're to speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. So there's a kind of speaking he has in mind. And what kind of speaking is that? We'll just read the passage. "But they are to be submissive, as the law also says." And I believe Trevor's right. The law he's talking about there is Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So that's where that law is given. And so this is something that's always been true. Any kind of speaking in which the women would be out of submission to the men is forbidden. And so she could not, for example, be a preacher over a congregation that is both men and women. She could speak to a group of women, but not where there's men present, because they're to be submissive. As the law also says, this is a principle that's always been true and will be true to the end of time. that when we come together to worship the Lord, where there's both men and women, the women are to be submissive to the men. And if they want to, well, verse 34 is enough. And so that shows the kind that's talking about here is the kind of speaking where she's not in submission. Now, not only are the women to be in submission to the men in the public worship assembly in the church, but in every other way in the local church, the women are to be in submission to the men. That would mean, for example, that the men have the authority to make the decision. Doesn't mean they shouldn't listen to the opinions of the women, just as I listen to the opinion of my wife. And when we had children still at home, we listened to our children in the home. But somebody had to make the decision to the home. That's the husband. And in the church, it's the men. Turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. And look there at verses 11 and 12. It's parallel to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. But it's not limited to the worship assembly as 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. By the way, the word silence there is a different word than the word in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And it means an attitude of quietness, an attitude in which she's not trying to take the lead. She's submissive. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Now that phrase, over the man, qualifies both the teaching and having authority. Women have authority over their children. Women can have authority in the business realm. I'm not even opposed to women having authority in the government realm. Deborah was judge of Israel, Judges chapter 4. And remember, that principle of the woman's submission has been true ever since Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So I'm not opposed to a woman being in a rulership position in civil government. It's in the church that women are to be submissive. And of course in the home also, as Ephesians chapter 5 shows. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now the context of that, and we've talked about this before on the program, is Paul is telling Timothy how they're to behave in relationship to the church. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, these things I write to you, though I hope to come shortly. But if I'm delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. So in relationship to the church, the women are to be in submission to the men. The men have the decision-making authority in the church. Now remember, that doesn't mean they shouldn't listen to the opinions of the women, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't inform the women about what's going on. It does mean that the decision-making is to be done by the men. And in a congregation where there are elders, then the elders make the decisions for the church, but that's another subject entirely. And so I agree with everything that Trevor said thus far. I just want to go in a little bit more depth on a couple of those things. Trevor, I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Well, I thought that was good, Keith. It doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I thought that was really good because we do want to give a good answer and explain things the best we can here. So that was good. I appreciate those things that Keith said. In 1 Corinthians, going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 here, which is our text of discussion, he is dealing with a submission, as we already have mentioned, and we'll probably mention again, but he's also dealing with a certain culture. And I think that's very important to note is who he's writing to. He's writing to the church at Corinth, all right? So these would be Romans, Greek individuals, Romans, and these individuals would have been what the Apostle Paul and others would call Gentiles, Gentile Christians in this case. Gentiles meaning they're not Jews. And in this case, in Corinth, there were specific things in their culture, in their society, I'm trying to get my wording right, but in their culture, in their society, that they would practice. And one of those things that was practiced was for married women to be veiled or covered. Veiled over the face, the head would be covered. And that was a symbol that she was in subjection to her husband. She's a married woman, and she is in subjection to her husband. You'll notice in verse 4, as we didn't quite read that yet, but it says, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Well, the idea there, having his head covered, in the original text is talking about having something draped over his head. The idea is he's wearing what a woman would wear, what a married woman would be dressed as. Well, that's not honorable, and nor does that give people the right impression of the Lord's church. Certainly, if you've got a man looking like a woman. And by the way, I think cross-dressing is dealt with to a degree here in this text.
Amen.
Men are to look like men, and women are to look like women, and that's the honorable thing to do in every society, in every culture, in every age. Well, here in this culture, and this particularly Corinth, they did have their women to wear a veil, a head covering over their heads. And so now it helps to understand it as we go through the text, because he's going to be talking about women being covered. In verse 5, he says, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered," to be unveiled, "dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered." And I think what we have to stop and ask ourselves is it always, or has it always been, shameful for a woman to be shaved or shorn? Is that true in every culture and in every situation? Well, the answer would be no. In fact, in the Jewish culture, and more than the culture, their religion, following the law of Moses, there were times in which a woman would be shaved. And it was not shameful, it was an honorable thing. In fact, I would like to look at that actually. I'm going to go back to the book of Numbers for a moment to look at the old law to help prove this point, that being shaved or shorn, as far as a woman's concerned, is not always shameful. In chapter 6 of Numbers, in the law of Moses, there was something referred to as the Nazirite vow. And God gave a law for the Nazirites and what they were to follow while they were under this vow. And it was for both men and women. I'll read just a couple of verses here of the passage. In verse 1 of chapter 6, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when either a man or woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazirite to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and similar drink." And I'm not going to read it. He goes on to talk about all the requirements while they were under this vow during this time period. And at the end of their consecration, at the end of that separation, let's see, it's in verse 18 here. It says, "Then the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head, and put it on the fire which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering." So that's a quick, just kind of looking at a couple passages concerning the Nazirite vow. You can read its entirety yourself at home. Numbers chapter 6. But in Numbers chapter 6, what do we have? But God's people, both men and women, at times these women, if they took the Nazirite vow, would shave their head at the end of their consecrated time. At the end of that time, shave their head. So would that be a dishonorable thing? Well, certainly not. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul talks about a woman being shaved or shorn as being a shameful situation. All right, well, these aren't Jews. And these are people that it would be, in their case, a shameful thing for a woman to shave her head in that Greek Roman culture. So that's important to note. So when he says in verse 5, someone praying, a woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered, that's the same as her being shaved or shorn. Well, that's a dishonorable thing. So in this case, in their culture, she would need to have a head covering. I'm going to stop right there, Keith. You may have some things to add to that or some different things. But
you're doing great, Trevor. I don't see any reason to stop, but I'll go ahead and add one little thing. Not only in Jewish culture could a woman be honorably shorn or shaved, but also a man not only could wear a head covering in worship, but in certain cases was required to wear a head covering in worship. The priest, the high priest, wore a turban during their worship to God. That was a requirement. So there was no dishonor to God in wearing a head covering in Jewish worship. This was not a Jewish custom we're dealing with. We're dealing with a Greek and a Roman custom, aren't we? All right, so go ahead, Trevor. I think you're doing really well on this.
Well, and going further with that idea about the man in the text, in verse 14 of the chapter, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, verse 14 of the chapter, he says, "Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him?" Well, is that true in every case? Well, certainly not. You go to the Old Testament, and there are men who had long hair. One of those men was Samson. In Judges chapter 13, God said that a razor shall never come to his head. From birth, he was going to be a Nazirite. And so, as an adult, he had never shaved his hair. He had very long hair, would have had very long hair. And in fact, that's where his strength lied. He told Delilah, the Philistine, and of course the Philistines cut off the 7 locks of his hair. Samson was that man who did incredible things with his great strength that God gave him, and he was one of God's judges for the people. Well, he had long hair. Was it dishonorable or shameful or a dishonor to him? Certainly not. God had commanded it. So again, we're dealing with different cultures, and in the Corinthian culture, it would have been a dishonor for him to have long hair. Even today in our culture, generally, women have long hair, longer hair typically, especially younger women, and younger men are going to have shorter hair. And that's kind of the thing to do. That's part of our culture. In their culture here, women were to have their heads covered. Married women would have a veil over their faces, over their heads, and their head would be covered.
Trevor, let me interrupt you just a minute to make a little comment in
Sure.
total agreement with what you're saying. I do believe a principle that comes from this passage is God expects women to look like women and men to look like men. And I know the origin of men wearing long hair in modern Western culture is in rebellion to what both society and to the God-ordained differences between the men and the women. So men ought to wear their hair in a manly fashion. Women ought to wear their hair in a feminine fashion. Trevor, back to you.
Well, I thought that was good. Yeah, and in verse 14 there that I just read a moment ago, he says, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? Well, the word nature there is referring to the local culture, the customs of your society, what has come into practice in your society. That's the idea of the nature, the natural aspect. And so certainly this nature is going to be different depending on where you live and in what society, what country you live in, what society you live in, as far as what is proper. And in this case, it was not proper, in their case, for men to have long hair. It would have been a dishonorable thing. And so it would be right for a man to have his hair long, or for a woman to be shorn or shaven, as he talks about earlier in the text there. So that's important to consider. What is natural is talking about what's going on in your society, what's going on in your culture and in your day.
Let me add something again here quickly, Trevor, in support of what you're saying, the use of that word nature. There's a parallel use of that word in Romans chapter 2, verse 14. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do the things contained in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. People don't just from birth obey God's law, but there were some Gentiles whose custom was to do the things that are in keeping with God's law. And so obviously the word nature, we would use it in the sense of second nature. It's become such long, ingrained custom that that's just the way those people naturally, that is, customarily, think and act. Okay, go ahead, Trevor.
That's good. That's real good. Yeah, well, in chapter 11, I want to continue reading where we kind of left off there. I read verse 5 about it being shameful for a woman to be shaved. I might have read verse 6. I'll go ahead and read it again, though. He says, For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Now, Keith already brought up earlier how the priests wore a covering on their heads. So again, we're dealing with a local culture and custom. In verse 8, For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So stopping there, and that's our text of original discussion, that was the question, was about verse 10. We're dealing here with women who are married in their society wearing a head covering to show that they're in subjection to their husbands, to show that proper relationship there and that they have the right attitude. So Paul says, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority. And what I believe he's talking about here is a symbol of her husband's authority. And on the flip side of that would be the fact that she is in subjection to her husband. She's showing a submissive attitude. All right, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. And then we come to the part of because of the angels. I'm just going to say I have no idea what that refers to, the because of the angels portion. I don't know why Paul added that exactly. Keith might have some things to say about that.
Well, I have an opinion on
Okay.
it. I don't believe I can prove it conclusively.
Okay.
But it is a passage of Scripture and it makes sense. Before I do that, though, right quick, the phrase "a symbol of authority" is all actually from one word in the original, authority on her head, and the three words "a symbol of" are added by the translators. In fact, you can see this in your own Bible. You don't have to take my word for it. It's in italics. The three words "a symbol of" are in italics. And I appreciate the Old King James and New King James translators of the Bible, when they added words that don't have a Greek word in the New Testament behind them or a Hebrew word of the Old Testament behind them, they put those words in italics. So those words are there to help supply the sense of what the inspired writer is saying. But, and I think they're right, that it's talked about a symbol of authority. I think that's a good explanation. But the word is just authority. But what's it talking about? Well, the best I can do to explain that is to look at a passage in the book of Jude. In Jude verse 6, Jude is warning about the false teacher who had already come at that time. And he's warning them not to fall for those false teachers. And he gives various examples of people who did not keep their proper station in life. And one of these examples is the angels in Jude verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. The angels, now this is all we know about it. People speculate about this and misuse passages that don't pertain to angels. And we've talked about that before on this program. But there were angels who did not keep their proper station, their proper domain in what God had for them, and so they were cast into outer darkness. They were cast down into Satan's domain. And so we ought to remember that. We have a station in life that we should abide by. And the woman's station, the married woman, is in submission to her husband. The women in the congregation are in submission to the men in the congregation. And he's telling you, keep that proper domain, that proper station. And remember what happened to those angels who rebelled against that. God cast them into outer darkness. Trevor?
That was very good. Thank you, Keith. As I said, I have nothing to say about the angels portion, so that was good. But going back to verse 10, we have just a brief amount of time left. As far as this symbol of authority, I think we've seen, looking at the context and the verbiage that Paul's using and who he's speaking to, and that's always important, is look at who the audience is. He was talking to Corinth specifically here. It dealt with a culture and a custom of their time. Today, women, to show submission, do not go around wearing head, something, a covering over their head or a veil or so forth to show submission. The Bible talks about other ways that women can show submission to their husbands in the home, inside and outside. And so in this particular case, there's no need for our women to wear head coverings, and certainly, again, this was not dealing with in the assembly as well. So to wear in the assembly a head covering, not necessary.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you for watching the program this evening.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.